Jack leaned back in his worn leather chair, staring at the faint glow of his phone on the kitchen table. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was late, too late for Claire to still be working. His mind replayed the recent weeks like a grainy surveillance tape. Late nights, vague excuses, and that faint whiff of perfume when she walked in the door after midnight. "Busy season," she had said, her polished smile never faltering. It wasn't the first time her career as a marketing executive demanded extra hours, but something was different. Her explanations felt rehearsed, her affection more fleeting. Claire always had a way with words, but now they seemed hollow. Jack had always been observant, an analyst by trade and instinct. Numbers never lied, and patterns always emerged if you looked hard enough. For 2 weeks he tracked her every move, not openly, but with subtle inquiries and careful observation. When she dismissed his offers to pick her up from the office late at night, red flags began to unfurl. The seed of doubt grew roots one Friday evening when Claire excused herself for yet another impromptu meeting. Jack's gut churned as he watched her step out the door, dressed impeccably in a tailored black dress and heels that clicked confidently against the tiled floor. Her tone had been casual, but her body language whispered urgency. Unable to sit idly by, Jack grabbed his jacket and car keys. His decision wasn't impulsive, it had been building for days. Tonight he would follow her. From a safe distance he tailed her sedan through the quiet suburban streets. The sight of her veering off from her office route made his grip tighten on the steering wheel. She wasn't heading downtown. Instead, she turned into a quiet residential neighborhood, the homes larger, more spaced out. The final blow came when her car slid into the driveway of a sleek. Jack parked a block away, his breath shallow. He could barely make out the outline of her figure through the windshield as she stepped out of her car, her blonde hair glinting under the soft glow of the streetlights. She approached the front door without hesitation, and it swung open before she could knock. A man appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of casual arrogance that practically oozed wealth. The two exchanged a brief, familiar smile before disappearing inside. It was him, Brian. Jack's suspicions weren't just a product of his imagination. The bile rose in his throat as he slumped back in his seat, his hands trembling. There was no way to misinterpret what he had just witnessed. But Jack wasn't one to let emotion override strategy. He pulled out his phone, opening the camera app with practiced ease. He snapped photos of Claire entering the house and the license plate of the car parked in the driveway. Evidence. Undeniable, irrefutable proof of her betrayal. As the minutes ticked by, Jack formulated a plan. The confrontation wouldn't happen here. It would be deliberate, calculated, and explosive. For now, he would leave, ensuring Claire never suspected a thing. As he drove home, his mind churned with possibilities. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following days passed in a blur, but Jack remained composed. He knew that letting anger control his actions would jeopardize his plan. If Claire and Brian were going to face consequences, he needed undeniable proof. Something that would strip away every excuse and leave them with no place to hide. Jack spent hours piecing together a methodical strategy, pouring his energy into uncovering the extent of Claire's betrayal. He wasn't just seeking closure, he wanted clarity, answers, and an unshakable truth. That Sunday, Jack installed a discreet tracking app on Claire's phone. It was a simple, yet effective tool he'd discovered online, a precaution he never imagined he'd have to use in his marriage. He hated the invasion of privacy, but her actions had made it necessary. The app would quietly log her locations, revealing any patterns in her movements. The following evening, Claire came home later than usual, muttering something about a last-minute client dinner. Jack watched her closely, noting the faint smear of lipstick on the edge of her glass as she poured herself a drink. Her polished exterior hadn't changed, but Jack could see the small cracks forming. There was tension in her shoulders, an unspoken anxiety that showed in the way she avoided his gaze. When she left for work the next morning, Jack pored over the tracking data. It confirmed his suspicions. Claire had spent hours the previous evening at the same suburban address. It was no coincidence. To solidify his case, Jack decided to follow her again, this time with more preparation. He purchased a high-quality camera with a telephoto lens, ensuring he could capture clear images from a safe distance. That Friday night, as Claire once again claimed she had an urgent meeting, Jack waited for her to leave before slipping out after her. From the safety of his parked car, Jack watched as Claire pulled into Brian's driveway. His chest tightened as he saw her exit her vehicle, her heels clicking against the pavement, her polished smile visible even from a distance. Brian greeted her at the door, leaning in for a kiss before ushering her inside. Jack captured every moment, his lens zooming in to catch the intimate exchange. The photographs were damning. A kiss, a hand on her waist, a lingering touch as they disappeared inside. But Jack wasn't done. He needed more than photos of their rendezvous. He needed audio proof of their words, their intentions. Using a parabolic microphone he'd rented earlier that day, Jack positioned himself a safe distance from the house, just close enough to pick up snippets of their conversation through an open window. The device worked better than he'd expected, amplifying the muffled voices into something audible. "He's clueless," Claire's voice said, the words carrying an edge of mockery that made Jack's stomach turn. "He doesn't suspect a thing." "You deserve better," Brian replied, his tone oozing confidence. "When are you going to stop pretending and just leave him?" Jack's fingers tightened around the microphone. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was a complete erosion of trust and loyalty. Claire wasn't just cheating, she was weaving a narrative that painted Jack as ignorant and undeserving. He recorded everything. The words etched themselves into his memory, but he knew having the audio file would make it impossible for Claire to twist the truth. He stayed there for hours, documenting every piece of evidence he could gather, until the night finally grew quiet and the lights in the house went dark. As Jack drove home, his mind replayed the events of the evening. His heart ached with betrayal, but his resolve remained firm. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. About reclaiming his dignity and ensuring that Claire and Brian couldn't manipulate their way out of the consequences. By the time Jack pulled into his driveway, a new plan had taken shape in his mind. The evidence was only the first step. The confrontation would come next, but it wouldn't just be a heated argument or a spur-of-the-moment explosion of anger. It would be an event so calculated and final that neither Claire nor Brian would forget it for the rest of their lives. Jack spent the next week in quiet preparation. The evidence he had gathered was airtight. Photos of Claire entering Brian's house, videos of their intimate interactions, and the damning audio recordings of their conversations. Yet, Jack knew that merely presenting these findings wasn't enough. He wanted a confrontation that would lay everything bare and leave no room. In the quiet of his home office, Jack went through his plan methodically. He contacted his lawyer, ensuring he understood his options. Divorce wasn't just a possibility now, it was a certainty. Jack wanted to protect his assets, and his lawyer assured him that the evidence he had collected would strengthen his case, particularly if Claire attempted to leverage their finances. Next, Jack took stock of the house. Claire had always been meticulous in her organization, but Jack began noticing details he'd once overlooked. Certain items, small, seemingly insignificant gifts, were missing, and he could only assume she had taken them to Brian's house. His suspicions were confirmed when he found receipts for purchases he didn't recognize, tucked carelessly in her desk drawer. It was another layer of betrayal. She had been using their shared finances to fund her affair. The following weekend, Jack saw his opportunity. Claire had mentioned she would be spending the day at a supposed work retreat, but Jack knew where she would really be. His tracking app confirmed it. Another visit to Brian's house. Jack took the opportunity to prepare for her return, transforming their home into a stage for the confrontation. He set up the living room with care, arranging the evidence in plain sight on the coffee table. The photographs were laid out in chronological order, a stark timeline of her deceit. Alongside them, Jack placed a laptop with the audio recordings queued up, ready to play. He also left a manila envelope containing the preliminary divorce papers, along with a note in his handwriting. "You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine." As evening approached, Jack waited in the kitchen, nursing a glass of water he barely touched. His pulse quickened when he heard the familiar sound of Claire's car pulling into the driveway. He stayed seated, his demeanor calm but his mind racing. He had rehearsed this moment in his head, but now that it was here, he felt the weight of the confrontation bearing down on him. The front door opened, and Claire walked in, her face lit by the faint glow of her phone. She didn't notice Jack at first, too engrossed in whatever text she was sending. It wasn't until she stepped into the living room and saw the carefully arranged display that she froze. Her phone slipped from her hand, landing on the carpet with a muted thud. "Jack?" Her voice was tentative, her eyes darting to the photographs. She reached out as if to touch them, then hesitated. What is this?" Jack stood and moved to the doorway, his presence startling her. "It's the truth, Claire. Something you seem to have forgotten." Her face paled, but she quickly composed herself, her usual charisma clicking into place. "This isn't what it looks like," she began, her tone controlled. "I can explain." "Don't," Jack interrupted, his voice firm but not raised. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending there's an explanation for this." He gestured to the photographs in the laptop. "I followed you. I saw where you went, who you were with. I heard what you said." Claire's confidence wavered, her hands twisting nervously. "Jack, Stop," he said, stepping closer. "I've been patient, I've been understanding, but I'm done being lied to. You made your choice every time you went to his house, every time you lied about working late, every time you used our money to fund your affair." Her eyes filled with tears, but Jack wasn't moved. He'd seen this act before, and he wasn't going to let her manipulate him again. "Do you think I wanted this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you think I wanted to hurt you?" Jack shook his head, his gaze steady. "You didn't care enough not to, and now, Claire, it's over. I've already spoken to a lawyer. These," he pointed to the papers on the table, "are divorce papers. I suggest you read them carefully." Claire's tears turned to anger, her voice rising. "You're just going to throw everything away? After everything we've built together?" "You threw it away the moment you walked into his house," Jack replied coldly. "You made your choice, Claire. I'm just making mine." The sound of the doorbell cut through the tension. Claire looked at Jack, confused, but he didn't flinch. "Expecting someone?" she asked, her tone biting. "I invited Brian," Jack said simply. "He deserves to face this too." The color drained from Claire's face as Jack moved to answer the door. Brian stood on the porch, his confident smirk fading the moment he saw Jack. "Brian," Jack said, his voice calm, "come in. We have a lot to talk about." As Brian stepped inside, his smug demeanor melted away under Jack's icy glare. The two men locked eyes, the unspoken tension between them palpable. "Take a seat," Jack said, gesturing to the couch. "This concerns you too." Jack closed the door, the sound echoing through the house like a final punctuation mark. The confrontation was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Jack felt in control. Claire and Brian had built their deception on lies, but tonight, the truth would be their undoing. Brian's confident swagger evaporated as he stepped into the living room. His gaze darted to the coffee table, where the photographs and documents were displayed like exhibits in a courtroom. Claire stood frozen by the couch, her face a mask of panic. Jack remained calm, closing the door behind Brian with deliberate finality. "You're probably wondering why I invited you here," Jack said, his voice measured. He crossed the room and stood beside the table, one hand resting on the evidence. "It's because this isn't just about Claire. It's about you too." Brian cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that fell flat. "Jack, I think you've got the wrong idea." "Save it," Jack cut in, his tone sharp but controlled. "You don't need to pretend. I've got all the proof I need right here." He gestured to the photos, the audio recordings cued on the laptop, and the divorce papers. "This isn't a misunderstanding. It's betrayal." Brian's bravado cracked as he glanced at Claire, who seemed unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Look, man, I didn't mean for this to get complicated," Brian began, his voice faltering. Jack's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Complicated? You didn't mean for this to get complicated? You seduced another man's wife, walked into his marriage like it was your playground, and now it's complicated?" Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Jack, No," Jack snapped, raising a hand to silence her. "This is your chance to listen, Claire. For once, you don't get to control the narrative. Jack turned back to Brian. Do you know what I've learned over the past few weeks? That trust isn't just broken all at once. It's eroded, piece by piece, lie by lie. Every late night, every false excuse. Claire's actions told me everything I needed to know, and you? He pointed at Brian. You're the kind of man who feeds on that, aren't you? Brian bristled, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he tried to regain his composure. You have to understand, Jack. Relationships are complicated. Claire was unhappy. Don't you dare, Jack interrupted, his voice low but seething. Don't you dare make excuses for her, or for yourself. If she was unhappy, she could have spoken to me. She could have tried. But no, she chose the coward's way out, sneaking around behind my back. And you enabled it. Claire's voice broke the tense silence. Jack, please, I didn't mean for this to happen. Didn't mean for it to happen, Jack shot back. Then what did you mean? Did you mean to humiliate me? To tear apart everything we built together? Because that's what you've done. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but Jack was unmoved. He turned to the table and picked up the manila envelope. These are divorce papers, Claire. I've already filed. You'll find everything's been taken care of. My lawyer has ensured my finances are protected. You won't get to touch another penny of my money. Claire's face turned ashen, and Brian shifted uncomfortably. Look, Brian said, his voice tinged with desperation. Maybe we can find a way to handle this like adults. There's no need to escalate things. Jack's glare froze him in place. Escalate? You think this is escalation? No, Brian. This is me putting an end to your little game. Jack reached for the laptop and clicked play on the first audio file. Claire's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. He's clueless. He doesn't suspect a thing. The recording played on, each word a dagger of truth. By the time it ended, Claire's tears were flowing freely, and Brian looked like he wanted to crawl under the couch. I didn't want to believe it, Jack said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. But there it is, the proof of what you really think of me. Claire stepped forward, her hands trembling. Jack, I made a mistake. Please, we can work through this. We've been through so much together. Jack shook his head. This isn't something we work through, Claire. This isn't a mistake. It's a choice you made over and over again. And now, you get to live with the consequences. Brian started to speak, but Jack silenced him with a glare. You should leave, Brian. Whatever you thought you were gaining from this, Claire, money, status, it's gone. You've gambled and lost. Brian hesitated, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation, but he didn't argue. With a muttered curse, he turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind him. Claire sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. Jack, please, she whispered. I love you. I don't want to lose you. Jack stood over her, his expression unreadable. You lost me the moment you chose to betray me, Claire. This isn't about love anymore. It's about respect, and you destroyed that long ago. Without another word, Jack turned and walked out of the room, leaving Claire to face the emptiness of her choices. Upstairs, Jack closed the door to his bedroom and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. The confrontation had played out exactly as he'd planned, but the weight of it still pressed down on him. It was over now. The lies, the deception, the waiting. Jack knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt free. The truth had been revealed, and he could finally begin to rebuild his life, one step at a time. The silence in the house was deafening after the confrontation. Claire had retreated upstairs, her muffled sobs faintly audible through the walls. Jack sat in the living room, staring at the photographs on the coffee table. They were no longer just evidence. They were reminders of the life he had lost and the freedom he had gained. The past few weeks had been grueling, but the confrontation was a turning point. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of clarity. The next morning, Jack woke early. The house, once filled with memories of laughter and shared moments, now felt like a hollow shell. He walked through each room, noticing details that had become invisible over the years. The way the light filtered through the curtains Claire had chosen, the faint scuff marks on the hardwood floor from when they'd moved in. It was bittersweet, but Jack knew he couldn't stay trapped in the past. He decided to start fresh. The first step was practical. Jack called his lawyer to finalize the divorce proceedings. They reviewed the documents, ensuring everything was airtight. Jack's meticulous nature served him well. His finances were secure, and there was little Claire could contest. As he hung up, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The legal ties binding him to a relationship built on deceit were unraveling. Next, Jack turned his attention to the house. It had been their home for years, but now it felt tainted. He decided to put it on the market. A real estate agent came by later that week, marveling at the prime location and the property's potential. As the agent snapped photos for the listing, Jack felt a strange mix of emotions. Selling the house felt like closing a chapter, but it was a necessary step toward rebuilding his life. Jack also began reconnecting with the parts of himself he had neglected. He dusted off his old hiking boots, setting out on trails he hadn't visited in years. The physical exertion was cathartic, and the solitude gave him space to think. He spent hours surrounded by nature, finding solace in the rhythmic crunch of his steps and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Each hike was a small but significant act of reclaiming his identity. Socially, Jack leaned on his close friends. He had been so consumed by his suspicions and the fallout of Claire's betrayal that he had withdrawn from his usual circles. Now he reached out, accepting invitations for dinners and meetups he would have previously declined. His friends offered him support and understanding without prying, giving him the space to share his story at his own pace. One evening, over drinks with an old friend, Jack realized something surprising. He was beginning to feel hope again. His friend, Mark, leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, Jack, I've always admired your ability to bounce back. You don't let things keep you down for long." Jack chuckled. "I don't know if it's resilience or just stubbornness. Whatever it is, it works," Mark replied with a grin. "You're already miles ahead of most people in your situation." Jack wasn't sure if he believed it, but the words stayed with him. Claire, meanwhile, made occasional attempts to contact him. She sent long, rambling texts apologizing for her actions and pleading for a second chance. Jack read them but didn't respond. Her words felt hollow compared to the pain she had caused. He knew any response would only reopen wounds he was trying to heal. Instead, Jack focused on moving forward. He took up a hobby he'd always wanted to try: photography. He bought a camera and began exploring his town through the lens, capturing moments he had overlooked in his day-to-day life. The activity gave him a new perspective, both literally and figuratively, as he started to see beauty in the ordinary. As the weeks turned into months, Jack felt the pieces of his life falling into place. He moved into a smaller but cozy apartment, trading the sprawling house for a space that felt manageable and personal. He decorated it with items that reflected his newfound independence: framed photographs from his hikes, a bookshelf filled with novels he had always meant to read, and a sleek desk for his work. One day, while organizing his new home, Jack came across an old photo of him and Claire from their early years. They were smiling, carefree, and clearly in love. Jack studied the image for a moment before placing it in a box labeled Memories. He wasn't erasing the past, just choosing not to live in it. By the end of the year, Jack felt like a new man. The betrayal that had once consumed him was now a distant memory, a scar that reminded him of his strength. He had rebuilt his life not out of bitterness, but out of a desire to be whole again. One evening, while watching the sunset from his apartment balcony, Jack smiled to himself. He had faced the truth, endured the pain, and come out stronger on the other side. For the first time in a long time, he felt free and ready for whatever life had in store.